Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Scientist on this series 4 on the LabZtorm impact, and this is an audio podcast around scientifical settings, Ztormtronix and terminology in disguise, and this is kind of a sort of an update or an emphasis on sort of an audio podcast in a previous series, and looking at sort of the another sort of surround an emphasis around that long-term condition that's been focused around throughout these sort of audios and podcasts, and that is looking at chronic kidney disease, and I'm sort of adapting understanding from the works of the Renal Patient Support Group, or the RPSG, and how they've sort of evidence-based their focuses across different sort of areas, and linking with this particular public health concern or dilemma. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the or elaborate or on the sort of issues and sort of issues and concerns really around the terminology. And so I'm going to break this down into three parts, or 4 parts really. There's a bit of an introduction, some main contentions, and a bit of a discussion, and sort of an overall conclusion, and actually there will be there is going to be a bit of a summary as well, and I will highlight some resources where listeners can actually go and check out these references themselves at their own leisure. As you know, anything that's done by under the Scientist and audio podcast, it comes under the Storm Robotics, a Storm Robotics production. To begin with, an introduction, and it is important to sort of appreciate that there are different definitions in literature, and sort of evidence-based publications out there that focus on this particular condition, that is chronic kidney disease, and that what separates acute kidney injury from chronic disease. In addition to what separates chronic disease and chronic illnesses, so for example, even terminology relating disease and illnesses have their limitations and are different as well. So in relation to CKD, or chronic kidney disease terminology, this can and has caused confusion in sort of the different classifications around the particular disease, and how it's also identified. A lot of the and just to highlight as well, or elaborate, that there is works that's been that's been highlighted and sort of put in context more succinctly by the Renal Patient Support Group team, and sort of having a glimpse at their work through for example, their ResearchGate page, and the publications and things that are outlined in there, kind of highlight how how important it can be to have understanding around this particular long-term condition, but also how it is a niche kind of specialty as well. So and that causes its own problem, at least in the public health domain. So chronic kidney disease is often referred to as silent. It's also irreversible, and it's an increasing issue in different populations, different ethnicities, and can cause immense human morbidity and mortality, and it can actually cause basically is a healthcare burden for those who may be living with the condition. So there is from the general understanding, there is different ways to identify sort of renal kidney insufficiency through a specific biomarker called creatinine. Creatinine is a byproduct of muscle breakdown, and basically the more a muscle breakdown there is, potentially, and also that's and by the way, with muscle breakdown, it's also sort of relatable to in some part in regard to red cell turnover. And so an online calculator has been available to kind of check out creatinine levels, and it is the calculation that's implemented is called an estimated glomerular filtration rate, and that is abbreviated as EGFR, to actually determine and assess kidney function and to confirm sort of diagnoses. So despite variations though in terminology, guidelines and frameworks divide and endorse sort of classification with a fixed with sort of a fixed parameters, arranging and focusing on renal focusing on impairment grading. So there's basically where this comes into play or interplays, and it does kind of can cause sort of impingement or further dilemma relating to classification, because when looking at classification or identification of particular CKD stages, there are 5 stages or five stages of this particular long-term condition, and they each have a severity aligning to particular estimated glomerular filtration rate, which is all well and good to a point, but then when and by the way, when looking at the classification and identification, all of these, generally speaking, the five stages of chronic kidney disease and the classification and identification that link to severity. Actually, all of these, make no mistake, they all have depending obviously different grading in relating to severity. So stage 1 or stage 2 are severe, but they are non-detectable. So actually, in general population health, from a general population health perspective, because it's not detectable, or it's not easily identifiable, they're severe, but they cannot be picked up so easily, whereas stages 3 to 5 are kind of more obvious, and that is when, for example, when they are more detectable, they basically the sort of pronounced understanding is by health professionals is to sort of control certain aspects of health, to prevent going into end stage renal disease or end stage kidney failure, for example. But when there is sort of impingement and where there is fixed renal, there's fixed renal impairment grading. The confusion can also be with relating to how information is related back to the patients and individuals who might have the particular condition, particular health concern in the public health domain. So, for example, they instead of for example, where all stages or all different stages of this particular disease are severe, because to know that, for example, someone is going to be diagnosed with that's severe in one way or another, and it doesn't matter actually which classification or identification of the particular CKD stage they're in. It is severe either way. Now, in that context, the fixed renal impairment and grading also in the public health domain, it relates to mild, moderate, and severe. Now, that in a way is actually I mean, basically, it is a way that not to cause too much anxiety for example, in CKD stages 1 and 2 versus 3, 4, and 5. That in the public health domain, that would be referred to as mild, potentially. Or pretty much ultimately, at least in today's context. And moderate is then stages 3, for example, and then stages and severe would be, for example, stages 4 and 5. Now, that all being said, actually, like I've said, and though it hasn't really been highlighted and documented, so in the public domain, public health domain, so much, actually all of these are severe. So because when thinking about it, the condition, the pretext is actually that the pretext is also that it's a silent sort of long-term condition, and is also irreversible. The fact that it's irreversible kind of gives it away, listeners, that this is actually the condition is severe. Has that severity, where classification is concerned. And so all of these stages are, generally speaking, are severe in one way or another. Now, there has been works that recognize CKD by prevalence, according to public health, between CKD stages 1 to 5, including stage 3, separated into stages, into divisions where it's been referred to as 3A and 3B, and some of that context has been highlighted in a previous audio and podcast, listeners. But where stage 3A is categorized as an estimated glomerular filtration rate as something between 54 to 59 mils per minute, which is basically the glomerular filtration rate, which relates to the rate in which the rate and ratio, really, in relating to how the kidneys actually get rid of toxins from the blood through urine, or when individuals are avoiding urine. So 54 to 59 is where 3A is concerned, stage 3A is concerned, and stage 3B is 30 to 44. So 44 mils per mil is is the higher end of the EGFR in stage 3B, and the higher end and the beginning end of stage 3A is 54. So when you think about it, when you think about it, either way, there's a narrow margin between 3A and 3B in one context, but there is also a narrow context between even more narrow context between stage 3 and stage 3 and 4, because the stages 3A stage 3A has been divided. Now, in a previous previous audio and podcast, there has been some understanding about the economical aspects around this, and how sort of general practitioners in a certain time point, I believe, and from papers that have been referenced, and I will highlight some of these papers in this audio and podcast, as well as listeners can follow up if they want to, and that is to say that general practitioners in and around 2005, 2006, 2007, or 2005 and 2006, but mainly I think to around 2006 period duration, they were sort of incentivized to help diagnose patients who were suspect or high risk for going into CKD stages 3, and so there was a lot of testing and investigations in laboratory practice as well, when that was happening. Now, stage 4, between stage 3 and stage 4, the margin between the two stages actually is dare I say it, is actually not too much of a not too there's not a narrow margin. It's actually quite a good sort of margin between 3 and 4. So it does so research it sort of begged the question why 3A and 3B were sort of developed in the first place, and obviously I've given some understanding of why that had been the case, or where healthcare practitioners, for example, may have been incentivized to do that, to diagnose as well. And there are certain guidances around acute kidney injury and classification of CKD stages 1 to 5 through different guidelines brought out between for example, the UK renal registry, NHS England when it was around. NHS Kidney Care when that was around, and then also around the time of when there was generally a big effort to diagnose and pick up patients suspect or high risk for these in the public domain much earlier, and basically there may not have needed to be that effort, and I don't quote me on that, but literature does highlight that there have been some issues around this, and I'm now going to highlight some aspects around the contentions. So modification of nutrition or health in this context and in relating to kidney disease, is perhaps one of the most extensively sort of complicated dilemmas. If not complicated, it is confounded by other comorbidities, which then relate to issues around why sort of individuals might be suspect or high risk. So there is a calculation, apart from estimated glomerular filtration rate, or EGFR. There is the MDRD, which is related to the modification of diet in renal disease, and basically that is had been used or relatable to context around different ethnicities and different demographics, so that they were more applicable to certain populations and beings who might be suspect or high risk. So therefore, MDRD has been one of the most sort of broadly used equations to calculate EGFR based on several variables. However, prevalence actually rises with age and is found to be more common in females than males, apparently, according to literature. And in one way or another, that's not surprising, because and it's not, whilst it's not definite or indefinite, it should be understood that females versus males, according to with regard to renal anatomy, the urinary tract is shorter in females versus males, and that actually means that they are more susceptible or suspect or high risk for kidney disease. And I think that's irrespective of what demographic or ethnicity they come from, because generally their urinary tract or the urethra or that links to the ureters have a similar size to those that are of males in one way or another. But then it's the urethra that comes off that comes off the bladder, and then to the part where actually where urine is excreted and voided. At that point is basically where patients females versus males, they have a smaller urinary tract. Probably it's estimated in anatomy textbooks or in publications, it's rounded off as something like 5 centimeters or 5 millimeters. I can't remember, but it's something in and around that. So there's a certain millimeters or centimeters where the female's urinary tract is smaller, is shorter than that of males, and then that can be problematic. And then the in this context, and the epidemiological importance of ethnicity and actually renal anatomy has not been completely articulated, although excuse me, although there has been publications out there to compare and contrast between different populations, etc. Now, there again, I will read out a few references or resources that relate to this. this towards the end of this audio podcast. Now, apart from those sort of overview of the sort of contentions, there are and because of there being a sort of a narrow margin between stages 3A and 3B, CKD stage 4 and 5 are have a sort of the same sort of margin as stages CKD stages 1 and 2. So there's a good generally there's a good sort of gap between them in relating to estimating glomerular filtration rate and renal function. But then it does beg the question again, sort of highlighted in a previous podcast, and one of the contentions is that, well, if stages 3A and 3B are where there's a narrow margin between them, then actually rather than having that, it should be reverted back. It could potentially be reverted back to stage 3, and then if there is a real need to add or investigate another margin for another margin for CKD stage, for another CKD stage, then that should be referred to as CKD stage 6, and then that actually because basically stage 5, for example, goes from 0 to 15 mils per min, which means that there's basically where patients will have symptoms of oliguria and anuria, so they may not be voiding at all, and a little bit to not at all, so that at this point is basically where they would be where patients will be prepped for end stage for a form of renal replacement therapy according to the guidances around that. But then, that being said, if that's not to 15, then actually stage 6, if there was going to be an investigation around this, then stage 6 would actually be should actually be 0 mils per min, and basically that really should be where patients are would have to be worked up for would be prepped more around having other form, if not a form, apart from having the forms of renal replacement therapy that would link to stage 5, then stage 6 would be where they would be worked up for an organ transplant. So in this case, a kidney transplant or renal transplant. Now, that being said, the thing around this is that also that stage 6 doesn't exist. It's not in general literature, and it's something that there has been some works around, though, by one of the academic leads for the renal patient support group, who's published in and around this, looking at this in a bit more detail, and it kind of makes sense when relating to public health, because a stage 1, for example, at least in the paper written by the academic lead in the renal patient support group, has highlighted that stage 1 is an important stage for screening, and same with stages 1 through 3. 1, 2, and 3 are more around screening, but different different focus, different practices around screening, and then stage 4 is where basically an individual has advanced chronic kidney disease, and then stage 5 is end stage renal disease, and stage 6 is actually basically in this particular work, it is actually where a patient has where individuals would have to have a form of renal replacement therapy. And actually, that being said, stages between stages 4 and 5, that does the work of having to go under a certain form of renal replacement therapy it does take place. The issue, the dilemma is, however, that traditionally, or for a long time, at least, dare I say it, that since the time of when general practitioners were sort of incentivized to actually pick up suspect or high risk patients in stages between stages 3A and 3B, for example. In that time, so around 2000 between 2005 and 6, or 2006, so over a number of years, there has been in the literature that stage 4 and 5 can be problematic for health general practitioners, because of the knowledge base around kidney disease is still not there, and is not part of sort of routine practice. Things like, for example, cardiovascular disease and other healthcare conditions, things like hypertension and all of those things, they are in the public domain and have been for some time. But chronic kidney disease hasn't made it in that domain, as far as literature has highlighted in some contexts and in some contexts and in some ways. So that then leads to the problem where the issue, at least, where then what happens is that patients, individuals, when they are in stage 4 and stage 5 and then prepped for a form of renal replacement therapy, it's actually often too late. There was a time in that duration where actually they were referred, individuals or patients being diagnosed at that time were referred to as crash landers, and actually in a way it was quite a fitting terminology. But the problem also is that patients also would find that health professionals and patients more prospectively, so in more recent times, will find that that's quite insulting, because to say that patients are crash landing into those particular forms of chronic kidney disease is as if to say that they haven't really been taking care of their health. And I'm sure there are individuals and patients out there in the world of kidney care practices, for example, just like how the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG team, have been sort of highlighting in their own way, that there are people who are very, proactive in looking after aspects around their, around their day-to-day, etc. So it was deemed as quite insultive in one way or another. So this then means that stage 5, which is end stage renal failure, or ESRF, or end stage renal disease, ESRD, which are sort of called kind of wheelhouse terminologies. They have been used sort of quite flexibly in one way or another. So those are some sort of additional sort of contentions around this, because it's important to know where the kind of where this is where there's sort of a prominence needs to be made on the educational stance around this in some way or another, and the RPSG, the Renal Patient Support Group, again have been doing that for the best part of a decade, at least from what I can understand of some of the works that they've sort of some of their research outputs relating to pediatric and adult nephrology. Now, a bit of discussion around this. So stage 5 can, as mentioned, can be referred to as end-stage renal disease, and sometimes even end-stage renal failure, as mentioned, or ESRF. Whilst this means the terminology associated with CKD stages can be interchangeable, it also causes confusion when providing patients with advice and care, or guidance and understanding. So what the so I'm now going to ask the question, and I will answer. I will answer this as well, at least in one way or another. So what defines, for example, in stage 4, let's presume for a second that or a minute that stage 6 does actually exist. In that context, what would define advanced? What would define stage 4 before stage, individuals or patients getting into stage 5 and being worked up for a certain form of renal replacement therapy or kidney replacement therapy, or KRT. Now, in that context, what defines advanced chronic kidney disease, or a CKD, which would which in some contexts could probably be relatable to stage 4. So then there is perhaps a requirement to develop plans to screen patients who are at risk earlier, to minimize further complications and potential comorbidities. But that being said, and throughout, by the way, throughout the whole CKD CKD clinical pathway, or whatever pathway exists around that, patients are sort of screened appropriately accordingly. But in stage 4, it sort of begs the question, on top of this, is apart from what defines advanced CKD, and should that be stage 4, it begs the question about is there a requirement to have more sort of health educational sort of avenues out in different sort of communal based settings in one way or another, to highlight to help minimize and bring awareness to the onset of potential complications, and thus offset, of course, patients coming into individuals and patients going into and being referred to as, for example, crash landers, because make no mistake, is very insulting. And so stage 3 is as mentioned, is subdivided in stages 3A and 3B. But number 1, the EGFR again ranges are quite narrow between the two. So again, there is a good so is there a good reason, or is there a good reason, or why that division between 3A and 3B had been prompted or encouraged? And so that's a question I've sort of highlighted in the introductory parts of this particular audio and podcast, but it has been sort of answered in one way or another in previous audios and podcasts, in a previous audio podcast and another series, a previous series to this one. But both subdivisions need to be accompanied by the appropriate terminology, and that's becoming, and that will be, and it's important really in that context, where and at least where in the public health domain, and in health, where health literacy and health language is concerned, because patients need to be able to, an individual need to be able to interrelate to the kinds of health language that health professionals might put in front of them. For example, so so both subdivisions need to be accompanied by appropriate terminology. If the present sort of classification and identification system continues as it is, or even if it needs to be sort of revised in some way, and that is actually the job, the work of what clinical scientists are about, at least those who work in or have effort in clinical chemistry. And so basically bringing that context into sort of conclusion and then a summary, this is what I'm going to say. Number one, guidelines on the management of chronic kidney disease indicate that patients should have frequent tests or investigations to monitor those at risk using EGFR and albumin, albumin creatinine ratio. So albumin is one of the biggest proteins that the body encapsulates, and basically that protein should not be, for example, if there's evidence of leaking and where certain conditions, certain healthcare conditions, such as, for example, nephrotic syndrome or lupus nephritis and other conditions, if there's protein leaking because of these particular diseases, kidney diseases, then basically that's a problem, because basically that's when the albumin creatinine ratio can actually means basically more protein is leaking when it shouldn't be. And actually, with protein, those nutrients that normally should be reabsorbed and used by the renal tubules and renal system generally, and back into through the general physiology and systemically. For example, glucose and other important nutrients that are needed to maintain general health and function, they can also be compromised. And so albumin creatinine ratio, or ACR, at least in literature, and some of the works again that have come out by the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG, and other literature, and I will highlight a few resources towards the end of this audio podcast, that anything that is less than 3 milligrams well, basically less than 3 milligrams per millimole, and look for anything less than that is actually it shouldn't be is not a problem, but that reference range, or that range, at least traditionally, has been important, because it gives scientists an idea that is actually the sort of almost dose amount of protein that is a maximum to be leaked, if anything is going to be leaked through the renal system, from renal through renal tubules and renal physiology. So and technically speaking, that should not happen, and also gives an indication of and warrant the requirement for further investigations around that. Another amendment to the guidelines, to previous, at least guidelines that have been documented, highlighted in the past, involves not testing people with not testing people as much with EGFRs or creatinine of 45 to 59 mils per min, at stage 3A. And people might ask, and you may ask, well, what's the point in having, for example, stage 3 and stage 3A and 3B, for example? Well, actually, that's the question. See, because as I've said in the previous, they were these two, the stages 3A and 3B, from guidances, had been in one way or another looked like, or it seemed that they were developed to incentivize general practitioners to actually pick up understanding around chronic kidney disease and acute kidney injury. Now, there are separate guidances around acute kidney injury, but we won't get into that because basically the acute kidney injury guidelines are more to do with have a link really to misuse of medications or overuse of particular medications, those drugs or medications that patients might require and need and are prescribed, but over time they can become there is that susceptibility to nephrotoxicity because the kidneys at the end of the day are actually vulnerable organs, and so that can be a strain, and acute kidney injury can result. So there are separate guidances around acute kidney injury, and the National Institute of Care Excellence, or NICE care guidelines, guidelines have been implemented around that in the UK, and I think in the US there's KDIGO, which is to do with the kidney disease outcomes. I can't remember the full terminology around that, but it's to do with the KDIGO is to do with guidelines around certain outcomes relating to chronic kidney disease. So if patients are not tested in the early stages of CKD, then the diagnosis will be delayed, and the opportunity for early intervention to slow progression of the disease will be missed and not really picked up. Individuals in stages 3A and 3B require, at least there had been some guidance around this about how the frequency in which they would be screened, for example. And literature has highlighted between 3 and 6 months, but 6 monthly are actually the average checks, the average screening time points for looking at estimated glomerular filtration rate in those with stage 3 and stage 3 or 3A or 3B. However, this has split classification and identification. It has caused some confusion in some way, and it has suggested that a further and this is why stage in works by the Renal Patient Support Group and the academic lead that's come out with some interesting information and understanding, that they've suggested that a further stage 6 should be included, that replaces stages 3A and 3B by a single stage 3, because again the EGFR margin is already narrow, so it's not really required. There should be appropriate terminology associated with all stages. So apart from the severity, as I mentioned, and again, all stages of CKD stages have severity. They are all severe in one way or another. It's just because they're silent, and they might not be. They might look absolutely normal in one way or another. They all have there's severity around them, and the fact that the condition, the long-term condition, is sort of irreversible, with the severity, the severity and the classification in the paper in the paper and works by the academic lead for the renal patient support group has highlighted that stage 6, for example, if that did exist, that would have that would actually potentially solve quite a few issues in one way or another, because of the narrow margin between 3A and 3B. So there should be appropriate. And just to highlight again, so you have severity and you have classification, but in the paper by the academic lead in the part of the renal patient support group, they highlight that stages 1 through 6 have certain lay information that the public or those who might be diagnosed with can kind of interact with or relate to. So for example, if we're going to have a discussion about this, then basically for example, one way would be to say that for example, one individuals having a discussion, and let's say both have different forms of chronic kidney disease, or there might be one person who's a completely, in I don't know, for example, in stage 1 or stage 2 versus stage, any other CKD stage. For example, there'll be information to say that there's lay context or lay language that relates to CKD classification and severity, so that makes the aspects around healthcare more interactable and sort of generally more approachable in one way or another. So that the works by the academic lead for the RPSG kind of highlight that in a journal. I think when looking at their work is published in something called the Biomedical Scientist. Now there should also be so that and by the way, that there should be opportunity in that regard that would actually prompt screening across different in different ways and potentially earlier, and offer opportunity to collaborate between different health centers, for example. So in conclusion, to put CKD guidelines into context in terms of the disease onset and progression to end-stage renal disease, or other terminologies, for example, acute kidney failure, or what used to be referred to as AKF, or ESKD, or end-stage kidney disease, ESKD, or CRF, or chronic renal failure, and or RRT, which is renal replacement therapy, but also it has now been updated in KDIGO guidelines in the US, actually, rather than using RRT, which actually patients and individuals in the health professional community in the UK, perhaps more so in the US, are very familiar with using terminology such as RRT, but that has been replaced by KRT, kidney replacement therapy. Perhaps as to dumb down some of the language, so it makes training future nephrologists a bit easier in some contexts. So as currently there is no consensus on how these terms or terminologies, with exceptions of RRT, are actually being used. So we are obviously literature and academics and researchers sort of put context together, they interplay with different language to ensure there's variability. Scientists and renal teams who have knowledge of sort of the laboratory parameters or the clinical parameters and so forth, and specialists understanding should also involve prospective discussions around that, and but in context of the public health domain, because that is actually what is required, at least how it's been highlighted by the academic lead for the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG. And then so that's a sort of a critical focus that needs to be interplayed into in general sort of in the general domain or public health domain. And so in summary, there is not always a consensus among health professionals and in the coding relating to terminology. For example, again, AKI, acute kidney injury, or ESRD, or end-stage renal disease, and other terminologies, for example. And this is where there can be misinterpretation and confusion with respect to CKD stage, CKD stage, severity, and classification, and also because more often than not, the health professionals that practice in this area of this specialty of medicine don't really have the sort of the lay context. Like if you look at tables, for example, and I think it's really so in works by the academic lead in the RPSG is they've in a paper publication that looks at sort of the issues around CKD terminology. They quite nicely highlight the different stages of CKD, but in a table split. They have a table that relates to severity, the classification, and the lay language that help those basically health professionals and patients can use to interact, and that will actually open dialogue and ultimately allow bi-directional or tri-directional communication, and that's actually quite important in today's world. At least around this particular condition, and so clear definition and clear definitions and terminology that relate to staging sort of have been outlined in various paper publications, but patients or individuals should know exactly what sort of classification or severity of CKD they actually have. According to the and by severity, that links to the EGFR, or estimated glomerular filtration rate, or and the appropriate terminology or definition whereby they can be empowered to gain to access and know how to identify resources to support sort of their healthcare requirements. So that's all I'm going to say on this, dear listeners. I'm going to read out a few resources, and this is what I'm going to highlight, and you can check these out whenever you sort of have time. So there's the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE. And it's a document called Chronic Kidney Disease and Early Identification and Management of Chronic Kidney Disease in Adults in Primary and Secondary Care, and that's actually was a NICE guideline that was published in 2014. There's a guideline by guideline paper that was highlighted by Livin, A, and Stevens, and it was a KDIGO 2012 clinical practice guideline for the evaluation of management of chronic kidney disease, and that was published in It was in 2012, but it was actually sort of a keynote paper in Kidney International in 2013. Then there's a paper by Fink, F-I-N-K, and team in 2012 as well, and this is titled "Screening for Monitoring and Treatment of Chronic Kidney Disease Stages 1 to 3," and it was a systematic review for the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force and for the American College of Physicians Clinical Practice Guideline, and that was annual internal medicine publication back in 2012. There is a really good paper by Just and team on looking at hematuria, which is a definition around hematuria is when someone voids blood as part, in their urine, and obviously that's unnatural because urine generally is sterile. So when hematuria happens, this is it's basically a sign, a kind of a link to infection, but can cause more problems. So there's a paper by Just and team in looking at hematuria, and hematuria increases progression of advanced proteinuric kidney disease, and that was published in 2015. There is a paper by this is quite an old one, but it's a good sort of initial go-to paper publication, sort of framework publication, and it's the National Service Framework for Renal Services, and it's chronic kidney disease, acute renal failure, and end stage and end of life care, and it's a part 2 document that was published in 2005, I think. Yeah, and so that's in 2005. There is a paper by Harris, and that's titled "Epidemiology of Chronic Kidney Disease: Global Perspectives," and that's a publication, a book publication by Burlington, and that's published in 2013. There is work by Tal, and this author published a paper in 2011 looking at predicting renal risk in the general population. Do we have the right formula? And that was a paper publication in the Clinical Journal of American Society of Nephrology, and that was again in 2011. There was also a publication by Gifford and team in 2011. It's titled "Chronic Kidney Disease Prevalence and Secular Trends in a UK Population," and this is the paper further highlights the impact of the MDRD, the modified diet, the MDRD modified diet and equation, and CKD, and epidemiology, which relates to the demographics, which relate to epidemiology relating the demographics of those who are suspect or high risk for CKD. So it's a sort of looking at comparing and contrast the formula, different formulas, and it's actually quite an intriguing paper to check out, and that was published in 2011, and that's pretty much the main papers. Actually, there is one more, as Hofstra and team, and they look at dividing stage 3 of chronic kidney disease, CKD stages 3A and 3B, and that was published in 2009 actually in Kidney International, and it's quite a good overview of the background around looking at stages 3A and 3B. So that's everything I'm going to talk about today in this audio and podcast. I want to say thank you for listening and checking this out, and make sure you catch the next one. This has been the Scientist on series 4 around the LabZtorm impact. This has been an audio podcast around the Shientifical settings, Ztormtronix and terminology in disguise, and it's been another Storm Lobostics production. Thank you for tuning in and checking this out. Take care now. Bye.